Welcome. My name is Michael Spath, and I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. We're the Indiana voice for peace, justice, human rights, and intercultural dialogue. And we're delighted to have Robert Cohen with us tonight. We've been able to spend a day and a half with Robert so far, so Robert, welcome to Fort Wayne and the Plymouth Church. I want to say that we're grateful to Plymouth Church for being a partner with us at Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. So thank you to Reverend John Gardner and Ruth Phillips and the members of Plymouth Church who have been partners with us from our very beginnings in 2003 and 2004 in our work in the community. Most of you should have in front of you our upcoming programs. We have a real active spring, a real exciting, strong set of programs this spring that we want to make you aware of. So please do take a look at the flyers that were on your seats tonight. 2 weeks from tonight in this room, a program dedicated to the memory of Rachel Corey, who would have celebrated her birthday this past week. She was a member of the International Solidarity Movement when she was run over by a Caterpillar bulldozer in Gaza.
She died?
Driven by an Israeli soldier, protecting the home of a Gazan family that was about to be destroyed with them inside. And we honor her memory. 15 years ago she died. And by holding a program featuring a present member of the International Solidarity Movement, Joe Catrone. So Joe has spent time in Gaza during some of the recent Israeli military attacks. So we're really delighted to have Joe here representing the International Solidarity Movement and in memory of Rachel Corey. Karen Meisner from Free Thought Fort Wayne and John Moore from Hoosier Unitarian Universalists for Middle East Peace. Would you stand up, the two of you? They're hosting, thank you, both of you. They have flyers for their program. We're a partner with Free Thought Fort Wayne and Hoojmi. We're partners with them for their program on Wednesday, May 16th. Thanks, you can sit down now. The Occupation of the American Mind. It is probably one of the very best documentaries that I've seen in the last in the last 4 or 5 years, talking about the Israeli propaganda war in cahoots with the United States, various pro-Zionist groups in the United States, as well as the complicity of the American government. So, the Occupation of the American Mind, Wednesday, May 16th at Unitarian Universalist Meeting House. And you have flyers that people can come and see you after the program and pick up a flyer. We're really excited to be hosting the father of Palestinian liberation theology, Naim Atik, on Tuesday, May 22nd, here in this room, along with Tarek Abouata, the executive director of Friends of Seville North America, the Christian voice for the U.S. Christian voice for Palestine. A return engagement, Ali Paris in concert. You might remember Ali being here. We had a concert up in Sweetwater back in February of 2016. Ali plays the canoe. It's a 72-string long, I call it, what would you call it, a table canoe. But anyway, virtuoso. He's played with Alicia Keys and Quincy Jones. There's ticket prices there. The reason for that is because this is a benefit concert on behalf of every dime that we raise that night will go to benefit children's programming, children and youth programming in Bethlehem and Nablus. So we have mission partners in Bethlehem and Nablus, summer peace camps, summer and winter art camps, a kindergarten in Nablus so that we help support the family clinic for people who make under $2,000 a year in Nablus. So every dime that we raise that night will go to support those children and youth ministries. Friday, June 1st, and it's here, and it'll be in the sanctuary. Arab Fest 2018, our 4th year for Arab Fest. We're really excited about that down at Headwaters Park. Free admission, lots of good entertainment this year, and of course the souk. The marketplace keeps getting bigger and bigger, and just a lot of fun, family fun. So join us for Arab Fest 2018. And then mark your calendars, our annual gala is Saturday, October the 20th. Ali Abu Nima is one of the foremost Palestinian American commentators on Israel-Palestine, and he runs a virtual web page called the Electronic Intifada. Every morning we get news articles, cutting-edge news articles from Ali and his team of journalists that are sent to us on the web. So we have a really strong set of upcoming programs, and I hope that you'll join us. I want to call your attention. I want to say thank you to Terry Doherty and the Board of Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. If you haven't seen the opinion piece in the newspaper this past week, I'm really grateful to our board for a strong statement about the slaughter, the Good Friday massacre of Gazans, and our calling attention to this in this community. So Terry and Indiana Center Board, thank you very much. You can find it online. It was printed, I think, this past yesterday. Friends of the Third World, Jim, we're happy that you're here. Take a look at their stuff before you leave. We're really grateful, Jim, that you and our friends from Friends of the Third World are with us. Tonight's program wouldn't be possible without the generous support of our partners, John and Jackie Moore. We're thankful to you, John and Jackie. Please pass our thanks on to Jackie, John. Mark and Carolyn Warsko are partners with us tonight. And also the program tonight is being sponsored partially with a grant from the Benevolence Committee of Plymouth Congregational Church. So we're grateful for all those partners tonight. Okay, well, Robert Cohen. We've been introduced to Robert Cohen through his blog, Micah's Paradigm Shift, and now he writes for Patheos, and he's one of the foremost, I think he's the foremost Jewish commentator on Palestine and Israel in the UK, and he'll tell you more about himself and why it's kosher to boycott Jewish journey to Palestinian solidarity. So let's say welcome to Robert.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Good. First of all, I need to just say thank you very much for coming out on this lovely evening when you could be at home watching the TV news and the countdown to World War III. But you've come out to hear me instead, so that's great. Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to say thank you as well to Plymouth Church for hosting us. Special thanks to Mike, who has organised my tour of the Midwest over the last week. Huge privilege for me to come to the United States and to meet folks like you and have a chance to tell my story. So thank you very much, Mike, for making that happen. And I also thank Terry and Margie Doherty, who've been looking after me for the last couple of days extremely well. Thank you. And Ron Caldwell, who I've discovered is my biggest fan. To come all the way to Indiana to meet him, so that's been fantastic as well. So thank you, it's good to be here. I'm going to talk for about sort of 30 minutes or so, and then I hope we'll have time for questions. So I feel like I probably owe you a bit more of an introduction. As Mike was saying, the publicity that's been following me around the Midwest all week describes me as one of the UK's leading Jewish dissident voices on Israel-Palestine. but I have to own up, because it's really not that difficult to be one of the UK's leading Jewish dissident voices on Palestine. It's a very small field. There's not much competition. So, just to be clear, in case anyone doesn't realise, you're not hearing from a mainstream Jewish voice. I am not typical. I am not representative. I am decidedly marginal, which is why I call the monthly blog that I now write at Pathos, Writing from the Edge. The Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is the oldest and most well-known Jewish communal body, they're not keen on me. The Chief Rabbi for Britain, Ephraim Burvis, he's not a fan either. I've spoken to many Christian gatherings around the UK, but I've yet to receive a single invitation from a Jewish organisation to speak. And I think that tells you something about the limits of acceptable discourse on Israel within the Jewish community today. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. My original blog, as Mike said, was called Micah's Paradigm Shift, which I think gives you another hint as to where I'm coming from in all of this. You'll all be familiar with the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, Micah, Amos, Jeremiah, and of course Isaiah. They began a long tradition of internal Jewish dissent, a tradition of speaking truth to power and calling for justice and righteousness without fear of consequences. Jesus was certainly part of that Jewish tradition as well. In the context of critiquing earlier Jewish kingdoms, you could say that the prophets of the Hebrew Bible were the original self-hating Jews. That wouldn't be my description, though. What's brilliant about Judaism is that we kept the prophets within the scriptural canon. We didn't edit them out, and now it's far too late. Thankfully, we're stuck with them. Now that's very good news for me and many other Jews around the world who now realise that speaking truth to power once again means speaking up against our own Jewish leadership and to the government of the Jewish state of Israel. My own take on Judaism and my attempt to find meaning in the many tragedies experienced by the Jewish people throughout our history is shaped by that prophetic tradition. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that what's the point of being Jewish, what's the point of being alive to the message of Jewish history if you don't apply that distinctive Jewish voice for justice? Without what I like to call that Jewish edginess, why be Jewish at all? Now, I do find myself having to say more and more what I'm not. So here goes. I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm not a self-hating Jew, unless you think that Isaiah was too. I don't want the destruction of Israel or a second Holocaust or the Jews of Israel to be pushed into the sea. Nor do I believe that anything that I'm going to say tonight would lead to such outcomes. So what do I believe? I believe anti-Semitism exists. It's real. It always will be. But certainly in Britain, there's a lot less of it than certain people want you to believe. I believe Jews, particularly in Europe, have suffered great discrimination and persecution over thousands of years. I believe Jewish people have the right to self-determination. But Jewish national self-determination is a whole different idea that turns out to be a lot less helpful than its advocates first imagined it to be. I believe there is a profound connection between Jews and the land of Israel, through our scripture, through our annual cycle of Jewish festivals, through a continuous presence in the land across 3 millennia. However, I no longer believe that this provides the proof or the logic for the revival of Jewish nationalism, nor the justification for a programme of colonisation that in the mid-20th century eventually, and I would say inevitably, displaced the majority indigenous people living in the land. Most importantly, today in 2018, I believe that our relationship to the Palestinian people is the defining relationship for Jews and Judaism in the 21st century. And right now, and for some considerable time, we've been making a terrible mess of that relationship. And if we don't talk honestly about this subject, why should anyone listen to Jewish voices on any other ethical issue of our age? Now, I grow weary of watching Jews speak out on behalf of refugees and asylum seekers all over the world, but failing to say anything about the refugee community created by our own project of Jewish nationalism. Okay. Thank you for that, Mr. I hope that gives you kind of an understanding of where I'm coming from and what I'm going to say next. And I always think it's a shame I can't fit all of that on a business card instead of having to spend the first 3 minutes of the talk setting it up. Anyway, the lack of Jewish invitations that I mentioned at the beginning is a pity, because when I sit down to write as a blogger, that's my main contribution to this work. I'm usually thinking of a Jewish reader, a bit like me, but not me today, a kind of version of me 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. I've been on something of a long journey on Israel-Palestine, but there's not time tonight to describe every kind of twist and turn of it. But I will tell you about my starting point, and we'll stop off at a couple of key junctions. I would trace the start of my journey to Palestinian solidarity back to my time as an undergraduate at the University of Manchester, not the one near here, the one in the north of England, okay, in the mid-1980s. With my final exams approaching, I should have been getting down to some serious academic work. John Locke and Jean Rousseau and J.S. Mill and Karl Marx were all demanding my serious attention 30 years ago. But instead, I was using the university student library to follow and attempt to understand the outbreak of the first Palestinian Intifada. The uprising that began in Gaza in 1987 and quickly spread to the West Bank. It was an uprising from the streets of occupied Palestine provoked by frustration and disillusionment, and it was characterised by strikes and boycotts and civil disobedience, and most notably, children and young people throwing stones at armed Israeli soldiers. The first Intifada was a modern-day reworking of the David and Goliath story from the Bible. But this time, the Palestinian children were David and the Jewish soldiers were Goliath. And that was an unsettling role reversal for someone like me who'd been brought up on those Bible stories. After all, surely we had written the book on what it meant to be victims of oppressive power, called the Book of Exodus. How could this be happening? And you have to remember that in 1987 there was no internet, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, email was also quite a few years away. So to find out what was going on in Israel and the occupied territories, I based myself on the first floor of the library in the periodical section, when I should have been one floor up in the politics and philosophy department. And on the shelves in the periodical section, there were current and back copies of the Guardian Weekly and the New York Review of Books and Foreign Affairs magazine. And I sat there, often for hours at a time, reading articles by Americans and Israelis. And in particular, I was taken by the words of people like David Grossman and Amos Oz, still probably the two most famous Israeli novelists, and the most well-known Israeli liberal Zionists, and they were opponents of the Israeli occupation. Until the first Intifada, I had little sense of the Palestinians as a community with a heritage and a history as close to them as mine was to me. But now they were no longer just terrorists pursuing a militant cause that I didn't really understand. My sense of unease about Israel that had begun during my first visit to the country as a 19-year-old was beginning to find its articulation. Here was a people suffering in the West Bank and Gaza because of what my people were doing. Now maybe if I'd walked up to the next floor and opened those books on Locke and Rousseau, Mill and Marx, they could have shed light on the reasons for the Intifada too. Rights, liberty, freedom. Hadn't I just spent the last 3 years studying all of this stuff? The first Intifada for me was the start of a long journey of reading and reflection and finally encounters and conversations with Palestinians, and that's taken me to the place where I now stand. But fast forward a few years to Operation Cast Lead in December 2008 and into January 2009, and that made me realise how far I had already travelled from the community I came from when it came to Israel. I used to get the Jewish Chronicle, which is the oldest Jewish newspaper still in publication anywhere in the world, and we used to have it delivered to our home each week in Kendal in the north of England where we were living then. And although I knew the newspaper had been kind of moving to the right on Israel for quite a few years, it wasn't until I read its reporting on Gaza, the Gaza onslaught that was going on, that I could tell just how disconnected I was with the official Jewish communal narrative. The Jewish Chronicle's editorial line was adamant that every aspect of the military action was justified, responsible, proportionate, and indeed ethical. The only people acting without any morals were Hamas and all their Palestinian supporters. But I just couldn't buy this story anymore. It flew in the face of every other piece of information that I was reading or seeing. And it was then that I realised that I had no interest in ever returning to Israel unless I could meet and talk to Palestinians. It was a while before that opportunity arose, and it came thanks to a charity called Amos Trust, of which I'm now a trustee. The trip that I made with my wife Anne to Israel and the West Bank in 2011 was a turning point for me and the end point for my already very fragile affiliation to Zionism. Now, you can read all the books you want, trust me, I've read lots of books, but nothing matches seeing things with your own eyes and talking to people face to face. And that trip was full of mind-blowing encounters. And one day, with some Palestinian partners of Amos Trust, we sat beneath the shade of a tree in the village of Walaja, just near Bethlehem, with volunteers who'd been rebuilding a Palestinian home that had been deemed illegal by the Israeli authorities and then demolished. And the penny dropped for me that day that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians was not what I thought it was. What I was seeing was land theft and settlement building and house demolitions and water appropriation, parallel judicial systems, and this was no longer about them and us. This was not two people fighting over one piece of land. That framing of the situation had no relation to the facts on the ground in the West Bank. This was about power and control. One side had the power and that side controlled the other. I realised for the first time that this was not a battle between competing nationalisms. That battle had been lost in 1948, at the moment of Israel's creation and the Palestinian Nakba. For decades, the conflict has been about those that have rights and those that don't. And that makes it vastly asymmetrical, and it undermines much of the Jewish narrative around the peace process that calls for direct negotiations between the two sides as if they're equals, with equal standing, equal rights, equal negotiating power. They're not. There is no balance. It is not a question of them and us. It's become a question of human rights and human wrongs. And the question in my head from that moment on was, where do I stand in such a situation? How does this make me feel as a Jew? By the way, if any advocate for Israel tries to tell you that Israel does not practice the international legal definition of apartheid, then point to Area C of the West Bank, which is 60% of that territory. But of course, as many of you know, Israeli apartheid doesn't end in the occupied Palestinian territories. If it was only the situation in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem that I thought was bad, then I would still be what's called a liberal Zionist. The real challenge for my Zionism was meeting Palestinian citizens in Israel within its 1967 borders. A few days after that encounter in Walaja, our tour reached Nazareth, which is the largest majority Palestinian town in Israel, and there I met Samuel and Susan Bahu. Samuel was then the vicar of Christ Church Nazareth, and Susan and Samuel are Palestinian Israeli citizens. His families have lived in Israel and Palestine for generations. The Bahus, without the slightest anger in their voices, told us what it meant to them and their young children to be Palestinian citizens of Israel. Citizens who earn their living in Israel, pay their taxes to the Jewish state, and remember, Palestinians are 20% of Israel's population. Now, I was familiar with the promises made in the Israeli Declaration of Independence in 1948, which said that the new Jewish state would, and I quote, ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. And this is a favourite little quote that the liberal Zionists like to kind of trot out all the time to say that Israel is a democracy. Well, it was clear from Susan and Samuel that the Palestinians were still waiting for this to be true. Despite the stated intentions of 1948, every aspect of Israeli-Palestinian life is disadvantaged compared to their Jewish neighbours. Susan and Samuel had plenty of first-hand experience to prove it. Education resources are consistently lower for Arab schools compared to Jewish schools. The school curriculum disadvantages Palestinian students who then want to go on to take exams to enter Israeli universities. Their exemption from joining the Israeli army, as most Jewish students must do automatically, then leaves them disadvantaged in the jobs market, including public services, where not having an army number has become a legitimate way to discriminate against Palestinians. Meanwhile, central government funding to develop and improve Palestinian neighbourhoods is vastly less compared to Jewish council neighbourhoods. And then there are the marriage laws that stop an Israeli Palestinian citizen living with their husband or wife if they are from the West Bank. There are the land ownership laws that prevent state land being sold to non-Jews, and most of the land in Israel is state-controlled. There's the law that stops Palestinian schools teaching about the Nakba in their history curriculum, and alongside those institutional and legislative discriminations, there's the casual racism that pervades Israeli society and culture. Palestinian citizens of Israel are the perennial other. They are at best tolerated and at worst seen as a fifth column, the enemy within. In all of Israel's history, Palestinian Knesset members have never been invited into a coalition government. And of course, I as a Jew could become an Israeli citizen the next day and would be welcomed, until they read my blog perhaps. The relatives of Susan and Samuel pushed out of Palestine in 1948 and their descendants had no such right under Israeli law. So is Israel the vibrant, thriving democracy that its leaders and ambassadors around the world speak of? Is it fair? Is it equal? Well, certainly it is if you're Jewish. And if you're not Jewish, it's a partial democracy. It's a democracy that sees a fifth of its citizens as a demographic threat. Yes, give them the vote, but don't give them any power or influence in the affairs of the state. So the big moment for me wasn't seeing the occupation close up in the West Bank. It was meeting Palestinian Christians at a church in Nazareth. This was the moment when I knew that I finally had it with the whole Zionist project, as it had played itself out over more than 120 years. The problem was not 1967 and the occupied territories. It wasn't even 1948 and the circumstances around the creation of the Israeli state. The problem was the entire Zionist idea, which was fatally flawed from its late 19th century outset. So where did that lead me? Because now I felt a strong sense of personal responsibility for all of this. I couldn't just walk away from it. By virtue of my birth, my heritage, my upbringing, I was going to have to deal with all of this. Now I'm singling out Israel for my particular attention and criticism, not because I think Israel is the worst or the most evil state in the world. It isn't. I'm singling it out precisely because I'm Jewish, and these things have happened and continue to happen in the name of the Jewish people around the world. Because of all of this, I have trouble finding a synagogue that I'd be happy to go to. Distance is part of the problem. I live in one of the least Jewish parts of the United Kingdom, in North Yorkshire, but so too is Zionism. Since 1948, and very strongly since 1967, Zionism has undergone what I describe in kind of business terms as a very successful merger with mainstream Judaism. And as our chief rabbi wrote in the Daily Telegraph newspaper in the spring of 2016, Zionism is an axiom of Jewish belief. Zionism is an axiom of Jewish belief. And most Jews in Britain would probably agree with him. Our religious and communal leadership have done a superb job in mixing and muddling religious connections with a modern political project dreamt up mostly by secular Jewish socialists in 19th century Russia. So much so that if you're a critic of Israel, a synagogue can be a very uncomfortable place to be. Now, a couple of months ago, I wrote a blog post about Israeli Apartheid Week. Israeli Apartheid Week has been going for about 14 years now, and it's an annual event, usually takes place on student campuses, and it's the opportunity to raise awareness and understanding of the Palestinian story. And I wrote this blog asking young Jews to face into their racism. And for a long time I've resisted using the word racism when it comes to Zionism in my writing and in my talks, knowing that it's one of those words that kind of closes down the shutters for most liberal Zionists and leaves me open to counter accusations for daring to describe Zionism with such toxic language. But I've come to see that the way that we view the Palestinian people cannot be understood in any other way than racism. And that racism has been created through our attachment to Zionism. And this is how I think it is for most, but not all, of the Jewish community in Britain, and perhaps the United States too, when it comes to thinking about the Palestinian people. Whether consciously or not, we're suspicious of them. We don't trust them. We believe our needs are greater than theirs. We believe our claims are stronger and more culturally important. We see ourselves as vulnerable. We see them as a threat. We act in good faith while they are deceitful. We ask only for what is rightfully ours while they make unreasonable demands. We protect ourselves, they seek only our destruction. It's a set of attitudes and dispositions that I think adds up to racism. And let me offer some examples of how this Jewish racism through Zionism against the Palestinian people plays itself out through double standards and inconsistencies and hypocrisy. If you think we Jews have an obligation to remember our homeland, while Palestinians should be encouraged to forget theirs, then I think that's racism. If you think our Jewish right of return after 2,000 years' absence is sacred and undeniable, but the right of return for Palestinians and their descendants who fled their homes only in 1948, if that's illegitimate, then I think you're being racist. If you memorialise atrocities carried out against the Jewish people throughout our history, but downplay or dismiss the Palestinian Nakba, that's racism. If you think Jewish national self-determination is an incontestable right, but Palestinian national self-determination must be negotiated and often only as a reward for good behaviour, that's racism. Now, as I predicted, I picked up quite a lot of flack for that particular blog post. One former British Jew now living in the Israeli coastal town of Netanya told me that I had passed a new litmus test for Jewish self-hatred. And as far as I could work out, I'm not a chemist, the test goes no further than asking, am I a Zionist? And if I'm not, I'm automatically a self-hating Jew. You know, this is ignorant and stupid in the extreme. What's interesting is how determined people are to police this narrow nationalist definition of being Jewish. 3,000 years of Jewish diversity in politics and culture and indeed ethnicity appear to count for nothing. Nor does 120 years of Jewish opposition to Zionism, which for the first 50 of those years actually reflected mainstream Jewish opinion all over the world. The question I always want to put back to those that insist on defending their religious nationalist identity is this: what happens to your sacrosanct understanding of being Jewish when it becomes another people's catastrophe. Now, I was also accused, not for the first time, of being one-sided in my writing. What about the decades of Palestinian rejection of peace offers? What about suicide bombers and the anti-Semitic Hamas Charter? What about Palestinian corruption? Why do you only criticise Israel? You must be anti-Semitic. Well, listing Palestinian rejectionism only makes sense if you think that Zionism was legitimate in the first place. Otherwise, they are simply protesting an injustice that's been committed against them. Asking Palestinians to accept Zionism and Israel as the Jewish state means asking them to accept the rightness of the settler colonial project that has displaced them. Why should they do that? Now, to make the case for Palestinian solidarity, I don't have to defend anti-Semitic Hamas charters or the duplicity of surrounding Arab states. I'd much rather Arabs and Palestinians criticise their own leaders. Nor do I have to be involved in every other cause of justice in the world before I'm allowed to comment on this one. Would you accuse someone who gives their time exclusively to Tibet or to the Kurds or to Sudan of somehow being disingenuous because they don't also campaign on 10 other things? That's absurd. We choose our causes because they resonate with our values or because we have a personal connection. That's natural behaviour. I criticise the leadership of my community because I believe I have the right and indeed the obligation to do so. That does not mean that I think every Palestinian leader is a saint, but there are plenty of other people around more than happy to criticise Palestinians, whereas Jewish critics of Zionism are in short supply. So I know my job and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you.
Because for me, this can't just be an Arab-Palestinian cause, or a Christian cause, or an Islamic cause, or a cause for liberal humanitarians. It has to be a Jewish cause too. I can't think of a more important issue facing Jews, not just in Israel, but around the world, than the future of our relationship with the Palestinian people. Currently, it's corroding the community, and it's corroding Judaism itself. But if Judaism helped us get us into this mess, then I like to think that Judaism can help us get us out of it as well. Judaism has always been moving and changing. If it hadn't moved and changed, we would still be in a cult of animal sacrifice in a temple in Jerusalem. Now, some members of the Israeli Knesset would quite like to bring that all back. I have no idea why. Judaism, over the last 2,000 years, has found how to renew itself and adapt to the circumstances of its people time and time again. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs likes to say that anti-Zionism is just the latest mutation of anti-Semitism. I think it's more accurate to say that Zionism is the latest mutation of Judaism. Zionism, as a framework for understanding the Jewish condition in Europe, provided some useful analysis, but the solution it offered turned out to be ill-conceived. So we need to let go of that and move on. There needs to be a further evolution of Judaism, one that's fit for purpose in the 21st century and not the 19th. A Judaism that draws on the contribution it's made to the understanding of a God-created, universal human equality and dignity. And that means dropping some language and ideas, or perhaps respecting them as part of our heritage, but not necessarily part of our future. For example, Israel as a Jewish homeland, based on our history and religion and culture, makes sense. I don't have a problem with the idea of a Jewish homeland in Israel. But Israel as the Jewish state that necessitates the displacement of an indigenous people turns out to be a political and moral dead end. For most of our history, we've not been in possession of the land of Israel, yet we survived, sometimes struggling, but often thriving. Jewish survival and safety and our ability to flourish was never contingent on the domination of the Promised Land. In fact, if you know your Bible, you know that every time you've had a kingdom, it's ended badly. Isn't that an equally valid lesson of Jewish history? The history of Jews in the 20th century has focused on the history of the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel. and how that murder of 6 million Jews justified and necessitated Israel's creation. But the 20th century was also the history of the Jews who came to America and created the most successful and accepted Jewish community in our entire history, excelling in every avenue of human endeavour. Why don't we talk about that more? Okay. I'm going to skip a little bit to make sure we have time for questions. So what happens next on Israel-Palestine? I suspect more of the same. The occupation will continue, the siege of Gaza will continue. I hate to think what we might see tomorrow on the Gaza border again as the demonstrations go into their third week. The Netanyahu premiership may fall through the corruption allegations that are surrounding him, but I don't expect Israeli policy to fall with him. What's really changing is Israel's growing worldwide commercial strength in computing, mobile communications, security surveillance, pharmaceuticals, and of course, battlefield-tested weaponry. And much of this is the commercial spin-off from the occupation. And new markets are opening up: India, China, and soon, I suspect, Saudi Arabia. I support the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign as a way to lobby for equal rights, but it's going to be a long haul. If the comparison is apartheid South Africa, then I suspect we are in the 1950s and not the 1980s stage of the struggle. Many of you here tonight, and many of the people I've been speaking to over the last few days, are part of a Christian Kairos movement, a moment of truth, a moment of recognition and understanding that the time has come to do something on this issue. My hope rests on the belief that there is the possibility of a Jewish Kairos, a Jewish moment of truth, when we see that the cost of our Jewish redemption has been the enslavement of another people. A moment of radical self-awareness, a realization of the loss of our innocence. What's abundantly clear is that a Jewish Kairos moment will never come from the Jewish establishment. In the last 70 years, Zionism has become the dominant ideology within the Jewish community. Indeed, it's become the new Jewish theology as well, which is what allows accusations of anti-Semitism to be made against anyone who calls into question the behaviour of the State of Israel. Mark Ellis, the radical Jewish theologian, I know he's come here to speak in the past, he's one of my great inspirations, and he describes the time that we live in now as the end of Jewish history as we've known it, the end of Jewish history as we've known it. And I think he's right about that. I think we failed to recognise what has changed for Jews in the last 70 years. For the first time in 2,000 years, we have power and influence and a mini empire of our own. Now, don't get me wrong, having power and influence is not a bad thing in itself, and ask anyone that hasn't got it, and ask the Palestinians perhaps. The point is what you do with your power and influence. The Jewish Kairos moment will begin on the margins of the Jewish community. Often it will be Jews who don't express themselves in religious language at all. The Jewish Kairos will only come when we see that the Zionist understanding of Jewish history and the nationalist solution to Jewish woes was an aberration rather than a continuum of Jewish values. I look forward to that Kairos moment when a mainstream rabbi or synagogue congregation makes a categorical statement about the settlements and the occupation being not just obstacles to peace, but barriers to humanity and indeed an affront to Judaism. Then perhaps I can find a synagogue worth joining. For many Jews, the Jewish Kairos will be a painful moment, and it will require a new construction of the Jewish narrative, one that can incorporate the Palestinian narrative too. Meanwhile, Palestinians will need to understand our pain and our trauma as well as their own if open-hearted dialogue is to be possible. But remember, this is not a conflict of equals. We Jews hold the power, we have the superpower backing, the onus is on us, not on them. In the meantime, Jews who wish to stand in the Jewish tradition of universal justice will find their friends outside of the Jewish community. Our opportunities to influence events will be through our support of projects like Kairos USA. If nothing else, it will demonstrate to local church communities that Jews may be monotheistic, but they are not monolithic when it comes to Israel. There is a Jewish diversity of opinion that makes nonsense of anti-Semitic accusations. So, to conclude where I started with an attempt to introduce myself, I am a dissident Jew, I am an edgy Jew, I am at times even an angry Jew, but above all else, let me be a Kairos Jew. Thank you very much for listening.
There's enough for us to discuss with Robert after his talk tonight. Who would like to ask the first question?
I'll throw one out.
Ahmed, please.
More of a common question. There's a lot of, with liberal Zionism right now, you're hearing that the comment is about Netanyahu, and they're associating the whole uptick that we're seeing right now just to Netanyahu, and focusing on that a little more. How do you address the bigger issue within that group, and also how do you address Christian Zionism that's part and parcel of that whole dialogue as well?
Okay, so well, Ahmed, I think we'll just sort of play back the question so that everyone else can hear it. Liberal Zionists tend to kind of put all the blame on leading Netanyahu, and if we kind of got rid of Netanyahu, then Zionism would be okay again. And then you kind of threw in a massive big other question about Christian Zionism.
Because I didn't hear that term in your time. So.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Let me try and let me talk about Netanyahu and liberal Zionism. I mean, I was a liberal Zionist. It's like being an AA meeting. My name's Robert Cohen, and I was a liberal Zionist. And for a long time, I moved beyond that point, and then I kind of was at a point of view where I guess I thought, well, I'm glad that there are liberal Zionists, because at least they're not as bad as the kind of the real kind of ultra-nationalist settlers in the West Bank, so at least they're better than that. But now I've actually come to a different conclusion about liberal Zionism, and actually I've realised that they're the ones that are really annoying me, because I think they are the people that are obscuring the truth of the situation. And so they like to talk in terms of, when they criticise me, they will say things like, well, why aren't you more balanced? And then I know you're kind of criticising the Israeli government, and you should be criticising the Palestinians as well. And why can't you be a bit more even-handed? And now I realise that actually what they're doing is just obscuring the truth of the situation. And liberal Zionism, I think, is actually the real problem that I think we face in the UK and in the United States, because it kind of sounds reasonable. It sounds like, well, we need to be fair to everybody. You need to remember that the Jews need this, and yes, the Palestinians need something too, but can we be even-handed? And I actually think that's incredibly unhelpful, and it stops people understanding what is the situation on the ground. It stops people seeing the history of Israel-Palestine through a colonial framework, which I think is the best way to understand it. So I now have very little patience with liberal Zionism, and they might say that Bibi Netanyahu is the only real problem. If he was got rid of him, everything would be fine. First of all, we might get somebody far worse. There are a lot of people in Netanyahu's coalition to the right of him that are even way more unpleasant than he is actually. So that's one thing. Don't be careful what you wish for, because whoever replaces him could be a lot worse. But I think fundamentally, I don't think it addresses the root causes of the situation. It still doesn't address the condition of the Palestinian people and why that's happened, and therefore what needs to change. So that's okay. So have I dealt with liberal Zionism? Okay. Do you want me to deal with Christian Zionism now?
Well, just define it.
But define it.
At least define it and just give it an overview.
Okay. So Christian Zionism is a whole different thing from Jewish Zionism. I'm sure most of you kind of understand this. They're coming from a very different direction, and actually Christian Zionism predates Jewish Zionism, because it's a whole set of thinking that arises in the mid 19th century, that's around what are the conditions that need to take place in order for the Messiah to return. And it's all about a reading of the final books of the New Testament and thinking that it requires an ingathering of the Jews back to the land of Israel, and then it predicts what it thinks will happen, and it ends up very badly for Jews, actually. This is the thing that confuses me about Christian Zionism. Because Christian Zionism actually has no space for Jews as Jews in its end times scenario. Okay, we all burn, actually. So I can never understand why Jewish Israeli leaders or Jewish communal leaders in the diaspora are so happy to kind of rally up to Christian Zionists. Actually, I think I do know why, but I'll go into that in a minute. But I think Christian Zionism is the most anti-Semitic thing out there. Because I mean, that might sound a bit kind of strange, but I think that's what actually they are.
Amen.
Thank you. So, Christian Zionism, I understand, because everyone I've spoken to since I got to the Midwest talks about Christian Zionism. In the UK, it's not such a big deal. Okay, although John Hagee has actually set up shop in Britain now, and there is a British branch of Christians United for Israel. So we're beginning to get a taste of it. But it's not something that I have to sort of deal with on a kind of day-to-day basis in the UK. But I understand how significant it is here, and I sort of think it's probably more significant actually than the sort of pro-Israel Jewish lobby in the United States. And if you look at the Trump decision on Jerusalem, that felt like it was being driven far more by kind of Mike Pence and Christian Zionism than it was being driven by AIPAC. So yeah, Christian Zionism, they're about as bad as liberal Zionists.
Ron, please.
Yeah, I just thought when you commented to Ahmed, when you said that you're more annoyed with the liberal Zionists and that moderate kind of a thing, it sounds very much like the letter from Birmingham jail when
Yes.
King said he can take the KKK and the Citizens United Council, but what bothers him is the moderates, moderate Christian pastors, and remember that? So it's kind of interesting when you said that, it just rang.
Yeah, letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. It was written, I don't know, 55 years ago or something. Read it again, and then read it through the lens of thinking about liberal Zionism and thinking about what's going on in Israel and Palestine. It's incredibly, really resonates. Yeah.
Another question, please. Yeah, Isa.
I think absence of leadership in the Jewish community, especially in Israel. We don't have a Rabin, we don't have a Peres, we have Netanyahu, who's a short-term gains, coalitions, next election cycle. What's the end game? Somebody thinking of the end game, you start Palestine, 6 million Jews, 6 million Arabs. I mean, I think the problem's going to go away. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So what's the end game? I think is the sort of sum up question in terms of Israeli politics. I think the end game in terms of most Israeli politicians is that they think if they can just stall any kind of negotiations and peace process, and they've been doing that very successfully for the last 10 years at least, and just let the settlement building continue. And continue to have America kind of having their back at the United Nations, then the longer that goes on for, the more the possibility of two states is kind of finished and gone. I think it's finished and gone anyway now. But I think maintaining the status quo isn't really maintaining the status quo, it's actually embedding a new reality that the longer it goes on for. So I think Israeli politicians think, well, we just need to hang on in there. And they're probably thinking in terms of 20, 30, 50 years, to the point where everyone will just accept that at least that area C of the West Bank should be part of Israel. I think it'll happen much quicker than that, in fact. So I think they're just kind of like sitting tight and carrying on and thinking they'll get what they want if they just sort of maintain the way things are happening now.
Anita? Stand up, Anita, we can answer your question.
I spoke about racism and apartheid. It was stunning for me to hear Palestinian people speak about my understanding that Israeli curriculum would teach Israeli children that Palestinians are not human. They are not to be considered as an equal. I'm talking about speaking about balance. But I don't think I was aware that that's the lens through which perhaps an Israeli person views a Palestinian person. And then what would Christian people think about that? What would Jewish people think about that? Are we aware that the teaching that the Palestinians are not of the same humanity?
We heard that from Jewish Refusenik in Jerusalem, Saharbardi, and some others that we visited when Anita was there with me and Ann was with me in March.
I think there is this kind of cultural demonization of Palestinian people. The Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, are either terrorists and murderers or would-be terrorists and murderers, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel are kind of. I'm sure there are lots of situations where on a one-to-one basis or in a work situation people get on fine. And there are kind of everyday relationships that go on. But I think at the back of a Jewish Israeli mind is always a slight sort of discomfort or suspicion about what the attitudes or motivation of their Palestinian neighbours might be push maybe to shove. How would they behave? Would they murder in their beds? And I think this is reinforced through the education system. And it can be not just what might be, maybe not just what is written in Israeli history books, which gives a one-sided view of Israeli history, but also what isn't in the history books. It's the fact that if you don't try and attempt to tell the story of 20% of the population, and you kind of disregard them, that is part of the culture of racism that you then create. So the only way you break out of it is through a whole completely different attitude towards education. Proper school integration would be a big start. The fact that the school systems are separate, I can't really see how you can make a lot of progress until you deal with that.
Jay, and then Sam.
Yeah. What you haven't mentioned, and I'd be curious, today, since Britain was very involved with sort of the handing over of the lands that they used to occupy in setting up the Israel state. Where is the British government today on the situation in Palestine?
Go ahead.
And say a word or two about the Balfour celebration.
Yeah, so I think you were referring to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which had obviously its centenary anniversary last year. So that was a really important document. It was this kind of promise, intention that the British government made towards the end of the First World War. Said it was kind of favourable towards the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, even though the British government at that point didn't control the territory, but they were happy to promise it to. One description of the Balfour Declaration is that one nation promises to another nation the land belonging to a third nation, which is maybe that's kind of a definition of imperialism. But it was a very important moment because the Balfour Declaration is what kind of supercharged Zionism. So before Balfour, Zionism was a kind of interesting political project, but until it had that kind of imperial support from Britain, it didn't have much chance of making very fast progress. As soon as you had the Balfour Declaration, and as soon as Britain was on the winning side of the First World War and carved up that bit of the old Ottoman Empire, along with the French, suddenly it became a project that could be pursued with vigour, and that's what happened. In terms of British policy now, a couple of points I would make about that. So, the British government maintains a position that says the settlements are illegal and obstacles to peace. It believes in a two-state solution. Interestingly, it didn't come out and agree with Trump's announcement on Jerusalem, so the British government is not in the same place as Washington on that one, so they're kind of stuck to the position. So it's interesting to see whether we will, when Trump or his son-in-law eventually comes out with whatever the Middle East peace plan is going to be, if we're ever going to see it, I would be very interested to see what the UK reaction to that is, because if it really does kind of move away from what everyone's understood as as a two-state solution, it'll be interesting if the British government feels that it has to somehow realign itself to Donald Trump. The other thing you need to understand in the British context is Brexit. Okay, Brexit now is you have to see everything that goes on in British politics through that lens. I wrote about this a couple of months ago. We're sending Prince William to Israel. Okay, no member of the immediate royal family has ever made an official visit to Israel in 70 years. And the normal reason that's given for that is that when there is some progress on peace, then the British Foreign Office, who decide where the royal family go, will reconsider that situation. So interestingly, there has not been any progress on peace, but Prince William is going this summer. Now, the only way I think you can interpret that decision by the Foreign Office is that because we're about to dump all our old trading partners in the European Union, we're desperate to form great relationships all over the rest of the world. And Israel is seen as one of the potential existing trading partners where we can kind of make progress and increase the amount of trade that we're doing. So Prince William is clearly going there as a trade ambassador in a post-Brexit British world.
Sam?
In America, it's widely recognized as, I think, a litmus test that in order for any politician to have a prospect of holding a national office, they have to be sufficiently pro-Israel. In Britain, you have Corbyn, who's under attack for being anti-Semitic. But can you talk a little bit about Corbyn and his prospects? And also, I had a similar question. I personally feel that Britain is largely responsible for the problem in Palestine, based on history. And do you feel any special responsibility or particular responsibility as a result of that?
Repeat the question.
So the first part of the question was about Jeremy Corbyn, who's the leader of the Labour Party of Britain. So I'll come to that in a minute, maybe I'll try. The second question was about whether Britain should feel particular responsibility for what's happening and all that kind of Balfour Declaration background. So I think Britain should feel like it has a particular responsibility. And what's interesting is that most people in Britain actually, I think, don't remember anymore that whole British Mandate period that was running from the early 1920s through to 1948, when Britain was in control of the territory and was ended up kind of trying to be the referee between the indigenous Arab Palestinians and the incoming Zionists. If you talk to the Jewish side of the story, they would say that the British were unhelpful and didn't favour Zionism. If you talk to the Palestinians, they'll tell you that the British were favouring the Jews all the time. So it's like a place where one takes a choice on how Britain behaved during that time. But the British public today, I think, have no real memory of that part of our history. Unless you have a member of your immediate family who was serving in Mandate Palestine in the 1940s, most people don't even know this stuff. And the Balfour anniversary didn't get much attention in Britain. Got some, but most people it would have just passed them by and wouldn't really know what it was or what it meant. Jeremy Corbyn, I could talk all night about Jeremy Corbyn. Really interesting situation. So Jeremy Corbyn, if you don't know, he's the leader of the Labour Party, so that's the party in Britain that Tony Blair used to lead when he was Prime Minister for 10 years. Jeremy Corbyn is way to the left of Tony Blair, so think Bernie Sanders and then step a few more paces left. and you've got Jeremy Corbyn. Okay? Jeremy Corbyn is kind of almost like the accidental leader of the Labour Party. I won't go into how he was elected, but he is very popular within sort of Labour Party constituencies of Labour Party members out in the country. Less popular within his own parliamentary party, where you've still got more Labour MPs that are kind of more in the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown mould. The key thing you need to understand in this context about Jeremy Corbyn is that he has been a long-time supporter of the Palestinian cause. And indeed, he's a patron of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is the biggest Palestine Solidarity organisation in the UK. And I think you have to take that into account to understand why the Jewish community in Britain has been gunning for him ever since he became the leader of the party, because I think they fear that if Jeremy Corbyn walked into 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister, then British policy towards Israel could change significantly. And for most of the last 3 years, people probably thought the chances of this radical lefty winning a general election looks pretty slim. But last summer, Theresa May, who's the current Conservative Prime Minister, called a snap election, hoping to increase their majority, thinking that Labour were weak, went to the country and she made a kind of catastrophic political error, because actually Labour won 30 more seats and she lost her majority and had to form a kind of a deal with one of the Northern Irish parties to be able to stay in power. So since then, Corbyn has been in a stronger position within his party, so that's actually put the pressure on even more to try and destabilise him and cast him as somebody who is somehow allowing anti-Semitism to run rife in the Labour Party. Anyone that knows Jeremy Corbyn knows that he has been a solid campaigner against racism for decades and has been more active in fighting racism in the Labour Party than anyone in the Conservative Party for sure, and most people and most of the other Labour MPs in Parliament. So I think you cannot read the Corbyn situation without understanding his relationship to the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, Darryl.
Your introductory remarks about yourself, you indicated that you're a lonely voice among the Jewish community speaking to the Palestinian plight. Is that lonely voice making a difference within the Jewish community? And can we expect some more of those lonely voices?
Okay, so being a lonely voice in the Jewish community in Britain, and are we making any difference, or what's the prospect for change in that dynamic in the UK? Is that a fair summary of the question? Yeah, okay. The problem I think we have in the UK is that we're a really small Jewish community. So we are 0.5% of the population. So that means there's about 360,000 Jews in the UK. So that's it's tiny numbers. And although there are people like me, what's difficult is we don't quite have the critical mass that allows you to start getting kind of organisational structures in place. So what tends to happen is that Jewish people who are very critical of Israel or consider themselves to be non-Zionist or anti-Zionist tend to be on the left of the Labour Party, and they are secular Jews. So they don't need to sit on for years. And so there are groups of people like that. There was a very interesting group that you might have read about, because Jeremy Corbyn chose to go to their Passover meal, a group called Judas. Is that in the news over here? Yeah, there is a radical left-wing Jewish group who are kind of they're kind of anti-capitalist, anarchists, anti-Zionist, but firmly Jewish in their outlook. And they've inherited a tradition from Eastern Europe, the Bund tradition in Eastern Europe. So these were Jews in Eastern Europe in the turn of the 20th century, very left-wing, revolutionary, but wanted to keep their Jewish identity. And Judas in Britain have kind of the inheritors of that Jewish tradition. And Jeremy Corbyn, because it was in his constituency, he was invited, went along to their Passover meal, where they kind of tell the story of the Exodus, but kind of mix it up with a whole load of anti-capitalist stuff. And they've also got a fantastic sense of humour, Judas. They're very funny. Follow their Twitter account. They're hysterical. But it's small. It's very small. What I find much more interesting is what's happening here at the Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, because you here, because of the numbers, have got the critical mass. So you've got Jewish Voice for Peace. I'm speaking to them tomorrow in Indiana. Tomorrow. I'm very excited about that.
You're excited about the Indians?
Sorry?
You're excited about the Indians?
I'm excited about meeting Jewish Voice for Peace because they are. What I find interesting about them is that they are coming at their criticism of Zionism and Israel actually from a position of wanting to still uphold their Judaism. So they're coming at it as people who want to understand this in a similar way that I was sort of talking about tonight. What they feel is that this is an affront to Judaism and Jewish values. And they bring that with them into their campaigning, and they have a rabbinical council, for goodness sake. It'll be an awfully long time before we see that in the United Kingdom. So JVP, if not now, I'm a huge admiration for them. Excited to meet them tomorrow. And the question is, I think, what happens to those people over the next 10 or 15 years? Do they end up forming almost like an alternative Jewish establishment, or do they go back into their communities and become either new leadership, a different kind of leadership, or do they just drift away from Jewish communal life, which is the other possibility?
Just for public consumption, we have very close relationships with Barbara Harvey, who has spoken in this room, the head of Jewish Voice for Peace Detroit, Mark Snyderman, Jewish Voice for Peace Indianapolis, who you'll be meeting tomorrow, Brant Rosen, who is one of the founders of Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council. He's spoken here twice. So JVP has really been a partner with us here at Indiana Center for Religious Peace. Yeah.
I'd like to just recognize we have a number of friends who are watching, and I thought for Robert to know, Mark Ellis has been watching you.
Hey, hi Mark.
And others, Terry Householder is in Santiago, Chile, watching. And others. So there have been a number of people that connected tonight.
Terry's live streaming the event tonight.
Yes, and we'll try and do this for our events, and it'll be available on our Facebook page.
So please like Indiana Center for Middle East Peace on Facebook. You can. We have a number of announcements and this.
I have a quick question
tonight.
from some of the things you've said, both just now, as a Jew in Britain and just the Jewish experience in the diaspora. I have read analysis that says that anti-Semitism is at our highest point that it's been since World War II. Some analysis out of the university in Tel Aviv. From personal experience, you've got children in college and high school. Do you sense that anti-Semitism in your personal experience? Do you feel a rise in that?
Repeat.
Yeah, so Terry's question was about the rise of anti-Semitism. Some research that's come out that shows that it's anti-Semitism, and I'm essentially looking at both the right and the left, is at the highest levels that it's been since the Second World War.
That's what I read from a Tel Aviv university.
So there was research done in Britain last year as well by a Jewish communal body, which is very reliable and it's quite rigorous in its methodology. And they looked into anti-Semitism in Britain. And they reached the conclusion that Britain was one of the least anti-Semitic countries in the world. And that would be my experience. I think the story of the Jews in Britain has been a very good story, and a success story, one of which we have found enormous welcome friendship and support. I think there has been a rise in anti-Semitism. I think it's impossible to understand it without understanding how Israel and Zionism plays into that, and how some people can become very kind of ham-fisted and crass in the way that they sometimes express their anger about Zionism and Israel, and can find themselves slipping into traditional anti-Semitic ways of talking. So I think that happens. We've only seen that being counted in the research. Equally, I think you need to understand the rise of nationalism that we're seeing all over the world, certainly in Europe. I think things like Trump's election and Brexit are also examples of the rise of nationalism. And on the edge of that, I think we see anti-Semitism as well. So I think it is on the increase. I think when we look at these studies, you need to be very careful about understanding what is it they're counting, because I think they may be counting things that I would consider legitimate criticism of Zionism, which might get counted as anti-Semitic. So be cautious about the data and interrogate the methodology, is what I would say. And in Britain, there's a lot less anti-Semitism around than people like to maybe think there is.
We have time for a couple more questions. Yes, ma'am.
What suggestions or advice would you give Jews that are attending the synagogue? For example, we're going to be celebrating the 70th birthday of Israel very shortly. So there are going to be a lot of nationalistic activities to partake in, and when you're in that environment, there's so much pressure to be part of it, I guess you would say, and not, you're going to be labeled a bad Jew if you speak up
Are you
against
talking from personal experience
Yes.
here? Okay, I think so. So the question is advice to Jews who go to synagogue, and what can you say to your synagogue community, and in particular when we've got the upcoming 70th anniversary celebrations, and there will be celebrations for the creation of the State of Israel. I guess my short answer is I'm not sure it's worth having a fight, because I'm not sure it will get you anywhere, and you'll probably be left more scarred and upset than everyone else will be. The truth.
Yes.
And as much as it might be a nice idea to think that you can kind of man barricades and start a revolution in the synagogue, I suspect that's not possible, and may not be worth your effort either. I think if you can start to have one-to-one conversations with people who you think you know well enough, and who will listen to you, that's probably the best kind of way to go. Thinking that you're going to be able to change the mind of the synagogue council and those who are organising those kind of celebrations, you're wasting your time.
Andy?
You mentioned a few groups here in the United States, Jewish communities. You mentioned some Jewish folks in Great Britain. And it sounds like here in the United States, this is sort of gaining some traction in the land of Israel, Palestine. Would you say there's some grassroots movements that are kind of pushing in this direction as well? Because it seems like that's really key to changing the hearts and minds of people there. And you mentioned education and all those things, but I'm just curious to know if there's any movements.
So the question, if you didn't hear it, was about are there grassroots movements in Israel that are kind of progressive enough to get some traction and to make some progress? Yeah, was that a fair summary? So there are, and there always has been, there's always been Israeli Jews who, some of them not Zionist, or absolutely been unhappy with the occupation, with the siege of Gaza, and they've always been there, and they do as best they can, but they really are marginalised. the high point for that sort of thinking was probably in the mid-1990s during the kind of height of the Oslo Accord expectations. And then I think there were a few years when the potential to actually raise questions about Zionism and whether we could kind of become post-Zionist, or it was like okay to have those sort of conversations in the Israeli media. And I think those days died with the outbreak of the Second Intifada around 2000, 2001. I think that's what also kind of killed off the Israeli peace and justice movement. It's not to say they're not still there, because they are. There's some great NGOs like Beit Salem and Combatants for Peace who are doing really important stuff. But the Israeli government is busy trying to close them down and stop their funding. So they are in a really difficult place just to be able to keep going. They're relying on donations from people like us abroad to be able to keep their work going. So it's I'm not terribly optimistic about the situation of in Israel itself. I think they're not going to get there without our help. Yes, Mike's just suggested I kind of close with a few thoughts. I think I would say what you're doing, what this organisation is doing, and what you're doing by just coming out here tonight, and don't underestimate how important that is. Don't underestimate the importance of if things kick off tomorrow again on the Gaza border, the importance of people in this country and in the UK choosing to go out on the streets and demonstrate about that is very important. Because it not only just shows solidarity, but it shows other people who might see you demonstrating that there's some people in this country that care about these people. That's interesting. And don't underestimate the importance of lobbying your elected representatives. I've come to the conclusion, I was saying this at Mike's house last night, that politicians, they aren't really leaders. They don't lead, they follow. A few of them might be leaders, most of them are followers. And they follow what they think their constituents care about. So if they start to realise that enough people care about this issue, they will get a little bit braver. And they won't change overnight, but they will start to think, oh, okay, I could say something critical about Israel, I could criticise what has just happened on the Gaza border without the world falling in on my head. And it's because they will start to realise that kind of you've got their back. And that happens slowly, but this is the way it's going to change. Okay, it's going to be a very bottom-up, slow motion revolution. It's going to take a long time. I think we are talking about not just years, but decades before we get to a good resolution on all of this. But you've got to start somewhere. I think you are starting it. Just by coming here tonight, you are beginning something. Change has to begin at some point. And it's already happening, you're doing it.
We are going to say thank you one more time to Robert in just a minute. We're really very appreciative of your time here with us tonight, your strong message, your courageous witness in the UK, and now here in the United States and around the world, so thank you. I want to mention, if you'd like to be on our email list, if you're not receiving information about our programs, Joan, wave your hand over there, please. See Joan, and she'll take your email. Sam Jar, stand up, please. You have posters and flyers for the International Solidarity Movement event on April the 26th in 2 weeks. So see Sam if you know a place where you could put a poster or a flyer in a coffee shop, in a church, to spread the word. You have some of those, Sam, and you can hand them out. Karen Meissner and John Moore, you have posters and flyers for people for the occupation of the American mine at Unitarian Universalist congregation. So see John and Karen if you'd like to take some of those. Yes, ma'am, please.
I just wanted to announce, considering the fact that we're on the brink, teetering on the edge of World War III, we're having a public demonstration rally Saturday at noon in front of the courthouse.
This coming Saturday.
This coming Saturday, try to speak out against invasion or bombing in Syria, and I also invite folks to carry signs in support of Palestine as well.
Thank you. This Saturday, noon, the courthouse. So thank you very much for that. And Patty Pendleton, you have a word to say about we really would like your help with busing your cups and plates, but Patty, you want to say a word about that?
Yes, Plymouth Church is very, very environmentally conscious in the normal way that we make ceramic, metal, glass, and wash the dishes here. But we are trying to experiment to see if we can do it responsibly in a different way tonight. And so if you would pour whatever's in your cups, pour it in here, put the cups in here, and we'll replace this because we won't take it all. Empty your plates, take food, put the food down here, put the empty plate in here, and use napkins that are soiled only by water, and coffee can also go in here, because it will be accepted. So the instructions are here if you don't remember that. So thank you.
And let's say thank you to Robert one more time. Up here in the front, if you want to have a personal conversation with him. Godspeed you on your way home tonight. Thanks for being out here tonight.
See you in 2 weeks.
We'll see you soon.
Bring our phone to you tonight.
Thank you, Tony. I know.